it feels weird to think about after seeing them so much, but had some decisions gone differently during development, your favorite Fire Emblem character might have looked entirely different. I'm talking different hairstyles, different hair colors, completely different armor design. It's all part of the development of a character's final design. And on occasion, we have been allowed a look at the concept art created before the eventual canon look was finalized. So today, I'd figured we'd take a look back at what could have been. And for now, I'm only gonna focus on main characters, so lords, avatars, and other characters that are super relevant to the story, but if you want to see me tackle more characters in the future, let me know. We begin in Arcania, although it is unfortunately impossible to look back so far in the past we can see what these characters truly look like prior to ever seeing the light of day. It's simply too far back, no concept art from those days, if it ever even existed, has ever been shared. However, the way those characters are portrayed nowadays is mostly based on their designs hailing from the DS remakes, so Shadow Dragon DS and New Mystery of the Emblem. Especially New Mystery has basically become the blueprint for Arcania's own, in particular in regards to the first lord ever, Marth. Marth's modern appearances, so think Smash Bros, Awakening, Warriors and Engage, all show him with a design that is based on his official artwork for New Mystery. And for this art, we do actually have concepts, some with small design differences that went unused, but could as such have had a big impact on what Marth would still look like today. For example, several sketches shown here lack Marth's cape, making him look a lot more like a sort of sleek Myrmidon rather than the classic Lord vibe he's known for. Other poses change his expression pretty drastically to something much more determined, focused, even angry if you want to go there. This one is especially telling, as it resembles his final art except with a much more serious expression. Now, it should be pointed out that while these pieces are undoubtedly real and from a pre-finalized stage, we cannot know whether Marth was actually considered to not have a cape or appear more angry. It could simply be sketches drawn without a cape for convenience, since it's a background thing anyway, or with various expressions to see how that would look. However, we cannot use the same argument when a cape appears that in the final design isn't there. Then we're definitely looking at an early design. And that is exactly the case for Sida, who in the final game doesn't have a cape, yet this concept art clearly depicts one. I think it looks quite cool on her, and it helps sell her as Princess of Arcania, which she is of course in this game. Her lance also has a different design compared to the final look, and the heels on her boots are much more pronounced and high than they are in the final game. Well, I guess technically not a classic character, the fact all of this artwork hails from New Mystery means we can also take a look at what was planned for Chris. Based on this artwork, it appears male Chris was pretty much done by the time this was all drawn, with all that was left to figure out was how to pose him for his official art. All of these sketches show pretty much the same character, with, from what we can tell, the same details. Female Chris, however, has two sketches here that couldn't be more different. One is pretty much a rough sketch of her final official artwork, but the other one, here she has different style boots, ones that make her look a lot more like a regal queen rather than the country bumpkin she is in game. And probably the biggest change is that she was apparently at one point considered to be wearing a skirt, rather than shorts like she does in the final game. Unfortunately, the lack of color obviously makes it hard to say more, but we can pretty much conclude based on this that male Chris was finished earlier than female Chris. Let's move on to the nearby Valentia next, for Alm and Celica. Just like with the Arcania phases, we need to look at the remakes here, meaning Shadows of Valentia of course. For Alm, we have pretty much an official concept sheet that shows a much better look at what goes into his final design, as well as pre-finalized material that shows 3 potential Alm designs that didn't end up happening. The one on the left doesn't differ too much from his final look, but his chest armor is slightly different and his facial expression is also a lot angrier than he ever really looked in the final game. The one in the center is actually the one where his chest armor comes from, but this one goes for a below the hip look that I would describe as more barbarian, if you get what I mean. He also has a much larger head adornment here, similar to what Claire has in the final game. The art on the right is certainly the most different, to the point I actually went back and checked whether this was supposed to be art for perhaps a different class, but that appears to not be the case. Not only do the gold details feel pretty regal and classy for Alm, especially considering how he starts out, his expression also has a confidence and sleekness that doesn't really fit the character in my opinion. It is worth pointing out though that this art is the one where his boots come from, albeit colored slightly differently. So yeah, put them all together and these 3 create Alm's final design. For Celica, we have more or less the same pieces, although it must be said her pre-finalized art is a lot more similar to the final result. We can see there was experimented with blue highlights on her dress, which ended up completely scrapped, as well as hair colors that are a darker red than the orange coloration she has in the final game. Her cape was also considered to be significantly shorter, before then being made even longer than the final design, as well as having a red coloration, while in the final game it's more a sort of brown pinkish. I do have to say though, I kinda prefer Celica with a longer red cape personally. But the three on top here with blue and red details are certainly a downgrade, so in that regard I think they made the right decision for the majority of calls. Especially the blue highlights feel kinda cursed. Celica in blue doesn't feel right. We're gonna make a big jump through time next, from Gaiden all the way until the Binding Blade. While there is some concept art for Sigurd and Selef available, the sketches are hard to analyze for details and they're not in color, so I think it's best we just leave these for what they are and continue with Roy. Roy was originally the main character for Fire Emblem 64, and as such went through several design iterations before eventually landing on his final design. This is the absolute oldest, hailing from back when Roy was supposed to appear on N64. It's absolutely clear this design is still in the early stages. He looks incredibly generic and like a clone of Leaf at the same time. By the time Kaga had left and development was shifted to the GBA, these were the first pieces of art that became available. They made it instantly clear that a key part of Roy's design was for him to feel and look young, almost childish. However, when you look at later sketches, you can start to see an attempt to make him look ever so slightly older, from a young teen to an average teen, if you will, eventually culminating in a sketch that is pretty much the final artwork. While all things considered, Roy really didn't change too much. What I do find interesting is that this artwork shows that the symbol that would eventually appear on the Binding Blade, so his sword, initially started out as part of his chest armor. It's neat how it wasn't really replaced, but more so moved, leaving Roy's final design with easily the most bare-bones chest armor he had had throughout development. Then again, in his true first appearance, which is Smash Bros. Melee, his armor had not yet been completely stripped of its golden adornment, showing that Masahiro Sakurai was clearly working based on unfinished design sketches. Unfortunately, as much as I would like to talk about the West's first Fire Emblem lords, there is no concept art publicly available that shows what Lyn, Eliwood and Hector looked like during development. And because the same thing is true for Erika and Ephraim, we end up in Tellius to look at Ike, Path of Radiant version only though. While there is nothing earth-shattering hidden away here, what immediately jumps out to me is how much kinder and friendlier concept Ike looks. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying his Path of Radiant's final design is anything too grisly, but he appears a lot more determined and focused most of the time than what we see here. Ironically enough, it seems Beta Ike's cape is actually more tattered and beat up than his final game's version though. His hair is also still a tad simpler, making him look much more like Lords of old, rather than the pretty unique one he ended up being in the final game. While Ike may not have concept art hailing from Radiant Dawn, Micaiah does, so she is up next. What we have here is pretty much her final design, albeit with a cursed amputated arm version, as well as two beta designs that are completely different from what we ended up getting. I could sit here and point out every single detail, but I'm not really sure who I'm doing a favor with that, so I'm just gonna share my opinions while you can take them in for yourself. Personally, I think Micaiah's final design is really strong, with super striking colors, and I wouldn't really trade it for these two rejected designs. Both of them don't really feel that original to me. The one on the left has the blue-gold color scheme that is incredibly reminiscent of what Marv wears, or I suppose would go on to wear, while the other reminds me a lot of what Celica wears, or again would go on to wear. I do like the gradient effect on the sleeves of the one on the right though. They add a dynamic element that especially the one on the left kinda lacks. But yeah, my favorite of the three is definitely the one that actually ended up used. Time for Awakening then, which is not the most spectacular look, I must admit, but hey, I'll take anything I can find. For Chrom, we have this piece of art which shows his near final design at the bottom, but an unused one at the top, with the red cape immediately jumping out as a big design difference. One for the worse, if you ask me. Also noteworthy is that there are some shots here that have his cape covering his shoulder, which doesn't happen in the final game, so you can always see his brand nice and clear. As such, it could potentially hail from a time before Chrom had a brand there, or during a time where it was meant to be a secret he had one. While the art at the bottom is much closer to his final design, I do think it's worth pointing out his, let's call it main clothing, is darker here than it would end up being. It appears almost black, whereas in the final game it is certainly blue. Robin is a bit of a difficult topic for this video, since you can change their design at the start of the game, to the point that even though this big fella over here looks completely different from canon male Robin, he doesn't look too different from a Robin you can make. However, I do want to point out that all these example female Robins have short hair, which is completely different from final canon Robin, who has long hair. Perhaps this was changed when Lucina was introduced? It's hard to say. But speaking of the devil, here we have Lucina, who didn't change too much, but this piece of facial artwork does make me finally realize how the hell the characters in-game ever thought she was a man. Also funny to point out is that there is a note here on her concept art that says, "Sorry, isn't this how it would look if it were tied secretly?" Suggesting this was probably a revision of a past version of artwork someone else drew. And as it turned out, the maker of this comment was correct, because in her final design, the knot on Lucina's belt is tied exactly how was suggested here. For Fates, I don't want to get involved in a gigantic war of what constitutes as a main character, so let's keep it simple and focus mostly on Corrin. Now, Corrin obviously has a bunch of designs all across the different versions of Fates, but none of them look like this, and that's because this is very early concept art for the male and female variants. Personally, I'm kinda torn on these. On one hand, I think they look really good, and as someone who has never really been a fan of Corrin's final design, I would probably like them more if this were their final design. However, at the same time, I also don't think this design is a great fit for Corrin. It has very strong dark Nor energy, and while on one hand that works, seeing as Corrin does grow up in Nor and as such would probably wear Norian armor, I feel like this version of Corrin would really not mesh well with the rest when playing Birthright. The final design, without the darker details, is much more neutral, which works better for the choose your path and ideology philosophy of Fates. And while I personally can't spot much differences, here, have some bonus Azura concept art. Next up is Free Houses, where we have some neat, clean concept art to provide more detailed looks at Byleth and the house leaders. But the real interesting art is shown here. Early concept art depicting what Claude, Dimitri and Edelgard might have looked like. Dimitri definitely changed the least, that's easy to recognize. It's pretty much only the cravat, or whatever the white thing on his chest is called, that isn't present in his final design. He also has different boots though, from more proper, almost horse riding like boots to the more soldier like armored boots he wears in the final game. The real difference can be found in the other two houses. Claude really wears his Middle Eastern inspirations on his sleeve here, with the puffy pants being more pronounced, the traditional Middle Eastern belt around the waist, these adornments at his hip, and arguably most interesting, the over-the-shoulder cloth he would eventually get after the time skip. Except it's then black versus his predominantly yellow outfit, while here it is yellow against the predominantly black outfit. It also appears his hair might have been a bit shorter. This looks like it was meant to be shaved in the back. If you ask me though, Claude's final appearance is much stronger than this early concept art. For Edelgard, I mean, where to start? Her hairstyle isn't even finalized yet at this point, although number 1 would eventually end up winning, and arguably the most interesting is that there isn't really any red present in her design at all, even though that would be the color of her nation in the final game. It's more so purple pinkish here. Only her shoulder pads are really reminiscent of what in the final game is the Officer's Academy outfit, and she also wears a dark blue skirt, while she wears shorts in the final game. Looking at this piece of artwork, I wouldn't have minded if the skirt was kept personally. I think it kinda works for her. The rest is certainly weaker than what Edelgard ended up being, and I'm also definitely happy hairstyle 1 was chosen. I don't like her with that shorter hair the last two have at all. And finally, we have Alir, who may be an avatar, but has a design that is completely set in stone. And that means there is some concept art to look at. Two of the pieces are pretty much just crude versions of the final official art, so they're not more than a fun novelty, but the real kicker here is this artwork, that shows an early design of male Alir, without the controversial colorful hair. When compared to the sketch of the final design, differences are small. The bow around his neck is white in the final game, but black in the early design, and the cape too has its white details swapped out for black. All in all, this feels very much like an Alir that was designed to resemble Veil much closer. Or this is an Alir that hails from around the same time Veil was designed, because they look a lot more like siblings when you take this Alir design to compare with. Do note that while the hair is not blue and red, his eyes still are, so the colors are both still represented here. And as for Veil herself, all we have to look at here is the same style of crude sketch that is basically just a representation of her final design. Nothing here is different from what she would end up looking like in the final game. And that has been all of them. Which pre-release designs do you wish were kept? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing. If you really want to support me, you can now become a channel member to get all kinds of fun perks and help me keep bringing these videos to your doorstep every week. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.